Chapter 6, Parts 8, 9, and 10 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury, Chapter 6, Part 8. Struggle of Athens and Aegina. At this time Aegina was the strongest naval power in the Aegean. Hostile feeling had long been the rule between her and Athens, and soon after the fall of the Pisistratids the island had been involved in the quarrel between Athens and Thebes. Legend said that the nymphs Aegina and Thebe were sisters, but it was more than sisterly sympathy which drove Aegina to declare a state of standing war, a war without herald, as the Greeks called it, against her continental neighbour. Her ships ravaged Phaleron and the Attic coast. It was to be expected that Aegina would side with the Persian when he sailed against her foe, and would cordially desire the humiliation of Athens. The Athenians had some reason to fear that she would give the invader not only her goodwill, but her active help. Accordingly the Athenians sought the intervention of Sparta, complaining that Aegina was Medizing and betraying Greece out of enmity to Athens. The complaint was listened to at Sparta, and King Cleomenes, proceeding to Aegina, seized 10 hostages and deposited them with the Athenians. By this means the hands of Aegina were tied. She was hindered from lending help to the Persians or hampering the men of Athens in their preparations to meet the invaders. This appeal of Athens to Sparta to interfere and exercise coercion in the common interests of Hellas, and the implied recognition of Sparta as the leading power, has been supposed to mark a climax in that feeling of deference towards her which had been growing up both within and without Greece. The episode has been described as the first direct and positive historical manifestation of Hellas as an aggregate body with Sparta as its chief. This description is an exaggeration, for we must not lose sight of the fact, which is too often forgotten, and which Athens took pains to forget, that Athens was, like Aegina, a member of the Peloponnesian League, and the appeal to the head of the League was therefore a matter of course. The prestige of Sparta had indeed been confirmed and increased by a decisive victory which she had won a few years before over her old rival Argos. The battle was fought at Sipaya, near the hill of Tiryns. According to the story, the Argive generals acted with extraordinary folly, and were easily overreached by Cleomenes. They listened for the commands which the herald proclaimed to the army of their enemies, and then issued those same commands to their own men. Learning this, Cleomenes gave secret orders that, when the herald gave the word for dinner, the soldiers should pay no heed, but stand prepared for battle. The Argives dined in accordance with the command of the Spartan herald, and were immediately fallen upon and destroyed by their enemies. The disaster lamed the power of Argos for more than 20 years. The episode of the hostages of Aegina brought to a final issue the great scandal of Sparta, the bitter feud of her 2 kings, Cleomenes and Demaratus. King Demaratus entered into a private compact with the Aeginetans to thwart the intervention of King Cleomenes. Accordingly Cleomenes incited Leotychidas, the next heir of the Eurypontid line to which Demaratus belonged, to challenge the legitimacy of his rival's birth. A trial was held. A curious story touching the birth of Demaratus was manufactured and attested, and an oracle came from Delphi declaring that Demaratus was not the son of his reputed father. Leotychidas consequently became king. Demaratus fled to the court of Darius, refuge of fallen potentates, where as the friend of medizing Aegina he found a good reception. Then Cleomenes and his new colleague went to Aegina and seized the hostages. But the means which Cleomenes used to ruin Demaratus recoiled upon himself. It was discovered that he had tampered with the Pythian priestess at Delphi to bring about the dethronement of his enemy, and fearing the public indignation at this disclosure, he fled first to Thessaly, and then returned as far as Arcadia, where he conspired against his country. The Spartan government deemed it politic to invite him to return, and he accepted their offer of pardon. But his adventures had unhinged his mind. He became a violent madman, striking with his stick every one who approached, and his kinsfolk placed him in chains under the guard of a helot. One day, having forced his keeper by means of threats to give him a sword, he wounded himself horribly and died. Such was the curiously inglorious end of King Cleomenes, who, if he had not been a Spartan, might have been one of the greater figures in Grecian history. But his ambition was cabined and his abilities hampered by the Spartan system. Whenever, if left to himself, he might have pursued an effective policy, he was checked by the other king or the Ephyret. On important occasions during his life Sparta was called upon to take action in foreign affairs, and on each occasion we find that the policy of Cleomenes falls short of the mark owing to the opposition of his royal colleague. Even as it is, he dominates in Spartan history for more than 20 years. After his death, the Aeginetans sent envoys to Sparta demanding the restoration of the hostages whom he and the other king, Leotychidas, had delivered over to Athens. Leotychidas had been the accomplice of Cleomenes in deposing Demaratus, and was consequently at this time under the shadow of public displeasure. The Spartans were ready, it is said, to hand him over to the Aeginetans as a prisoner, but the envoys preferred to ask that he should go with them to Athens and compass the restoration of the hostages. The Athenians flatly refused the demand. Aegina resorted to reprisals, and a war broke out. It began with the conspiracy of an Aeginetan citizen named Nicodromus, who undertook with the help of Athens to overthrow the oligarchical government of his city. His plan failed because the Athenians came a day too late. The delay was due to the necessity of increasing their squadron of 50 triremes by a loan of 20 more from Corinth. These ships gained a victory and landed troops on the island to besiege the town, but the Aeginetans on their side obtained some troops from Argos and overcame the Athenians. This defeat caused disorder in the fleet, which was then attacked and routed by the islanders. But the double repulse was not decisive, and warfare was protracted between the two cities by desultory plundering raids on their respective coasts. The necessity of protecting Attica from Aeginetan depredations, the ambition perhaps of ultimately reducing Aegina to subjection or insignificance, sensibly accelerated the conversion of Athens into a naval power. End of chapter 6, part 8. Chapter 6, part 9. Growth of the Athenian democracy. The Athenian constitution underwent several important modifications in the course of the 20 years which followed its reform by Cleisthenes. There is reason for thinking that some of the changes which tradition ascribed to Cleisthenes were really not introduced by him. Under his scheme the power of the archons remained very great. They were usually men deliberately elected for their ability, and if the council of Cleisthenes was a check upon them, they also were a check upon it. The natural development of things was to strengthen the council and weaken the magistrates. And at length, some years after Marathon, this step was taken by means of a change in the mode of appointment. Henceforward they were appointed by lot. 500 men were elected by the demes, in the same way in which the council itself was elected, and out of this body of 500 the 9 archons were taken by lot. The result of any system of lot in the appointment to offices is to secure average honesty and exclude more than average ability. Henceforward the chances against any prominent statesman holding the office of chief archon are 500 to 1. It is obvious that the political importance of the chief magistracy now disappears. It is also obvious that a polemarch appointed by lot could no longer hold the post of commander-in-chief. That post must pass to those who were deliberately picked out as competent to hold it. The powers of the polemarch were therefore vested not in a new officer, but in the body of the 10 strategii, who were hitherto elected, each by his own tribe. Either now, or not many years later, a reform was introduced by which the whole people elected the generals, but they endeavoured so far as possible to choose one from each tribe, and we know no instance in which the same tribe was represented by more than 2. The evil of a divided authority was at first obviated by giving each strategos supreme command for a day, an experiment which to our modern notions seems almost childish. Routine business in time of peace might be transacted on such a system, but a daily change of command in time of war was naturally doomed to failure. There is no reason to suppose that it ever became the practice at the election of the generals to assign to one of the 10 a position of supreme authority over all his colleagues during their whole term of office. That would have been a reinstitution of the polemarch in another form. The danger of a divided command was avoided by a simpler expedient. Whenever the people voted a military or naval expedition, they decreed which of the generals should conduct it, and assigned a position of leadership or presidency to one of those whom they chose. But this superior command was limited to the conduct of the particular expedition, and the general to whom it was assigned exercised it only over those of his colleagues who were specially associated with him. We have no record touching the attitude of Cleisthenes to the venerable council of the Areopagus, nor do we hear anything about that body for a generation after the fall of the Pisistratids. But a new institution was originated during this period, which weakened the position of the Areopagus by depriving it of its most important political function, that of guarding the constitution and protecting the state against the danger of a tyranny. The institution of ostracism is traditionally ascribed to Cleisthenes, but it was not made use of till 2 years after the Battle of Marathon. The ordinance of the ostracismos was that in the 6th prytany of each civil year the question should be laid before the assembly of the people whether they willed that an ostracism should be held or not. If they voted in the affirmative, then an extraordinary assembly was summoned in the market-place in the 8th prytany. The citizens were grouped in tribes, and each citizen placed in an urn a piece of potsherd (ostrakon), inscribed with the name of the person whom he desired to be ostracized. The voting was not valid unless 6,000 votes at least were given, and whoever had most ostraca against him was condemned to leave Attica within 10 days, and not set foot in it again for 10 years. He was allowed, however, to retain his property, and remained an Athenian citizen. By this institution the duty of guarding against the dangerous ambitions of influential citizens was transferred from the paternal council of the Areopagus to the sovereign people itself. Footnote: it is important to note that the law of ostracism did not leave it to the discretion of the Council of 500 whether the question should be proposed to the assembly or not, but ordained that it should be proposed as a matter of course at a fixed time every year. This was an additional safeguard to the people. It has been suggested that ostracism was intended to replace Solon's law against neutrality, and was itself replaced by the Graphi Paranomon. End of footnote. If this clumsy, and, it must be owned, oppressive institution was established by Cleisthenes, it would follow that for about 15 years the assembly declined every year to make use of it, though it is stated that the chief object of Cleisthenes was to banish a relation of the Pisistratids, Hipparchus, the son of Camus. And in fact this Hipparchus was ultimately banished, by the first ostracism that was ever practised. And in the following year Megacles, who, though an Alcmaeonid, had espoused the cause of the Pisistratid faction, suffered the same fate. In these acts, as well as in the constitutional reform affecting the archonship, we must see the work of the progressive democratic statesmen, of whom the three most prominent were Xanthippus, Aristides, and Themistocles. These leaders, however, had separate policies and separate parties, and the people were persuaded to ostracize Xanthippus, and 2 years later Aristides. It is clear that in these cases there was no fear or danger of a tyranny, but that ostracism was used as a convenient engine for removing the opposition of a statesman who hampered the adoption of a popular measure. We cannot guess on what question Xanthippus stood in the way of Aristides or Themistocles, but it is possible that the ostracism of Aristides was connected with the bold naval policy which it was the great merit of Themistocles to have originated and carried through. An excellent anecdote is told of the ostracism of Aristides the Just, as he was called. On the day of the voting, an illiterate citizen chanced to be close to Aristides, who was unknown to him by sight, and requested him to write down the name Aristides on the ostracon. "Why," said Aristides, doing as he was asked, "do you wish to ostracize him?" "Because," said the fellow, "I am tired of hearing him called the Just." End of chapter 6, part 9. Chapter 6, part 10. Athens to be a sea power. But the greatest statesman of this critical period in the history of Athens, greater than either of his two rivals, Xanthippus and Aristides, greater than the hero of Marathon himself, was Themistocles, the son of Neocles. It may be said that he contributed more than any other single man to the making of Athens into a great state. The preeminent importance of his statesmanship was due in the first place to his insight in discerning the potentialities of his city and in grasping her situation before any one else had grasped it, and then to his energy in initiating and his adroitness and perseverance in following a policy which raised his city, and could alone have raised her, to the position which she attained before his death. In the 6th century the Athenians were a considerable naval power, as Greek naval powers then went, but the fleet was regarded as subsidiary to the army. The idea of Themistocles was to sacrifice the army to the navy and make Athens a sea-state, the strongest sea-state in Greece. The carrying out of this policy in the face of scepticism and opposition was the great achievement of Themistocles. He began the work when he was archon, and thus already a man of some prominence, 2 or 3 years before the battle of Marathon, by carrying a measure through the assembly for the fortification of the peninsula of Piraeus. Hitherto the wide exposed strand of Phaleron was the harbour where the Athenians kept their triremes, hauled up on the beach, unprotected against the surprise of an enemy, but within sight of the Acropolis. At that time, after the quelling of the Ionic revolt, Persian warships were cruising about the Aegean, and the possibility of an attack on Phaleron seems to have opened the eyes of the Athenians to the need of reforming their naval establishment. The hostility of Aegina was a nearer and more pressing motive. The Athenians had not to seek far for a suitable port. It seems strange that they had not before made use of the Piraeus, the large harbour on the west side of the peninsula of Minicia, which could be supplemented by the 2 smaller harbours on the east side, Monicia, and Zia. But the Piraeus was somewhat farther from the city, and was not within sight of the Acropolis like Phaleron. So long, therefore, as there was no fortified harbour, Phaleron was safer. The plan of Themistocles was to fortify the whole circuit of the peninsula by a wall, and prepare docks in the 3 harbours for the reception of the warships. The work was begun, but it was interrupted by the Persian invasion and by the party struggles after Marathon. Then the war with Aegina broke out, and this, combined with the fear of another Persian invasion, helped Themistocles to carry to completion another part of his great scheme, the increase of the fleet. A rich bed of silver had been recently discovered at Maronia, in the old mining district of Laurion, and had suddenly brought into the public treasury a large sum, perhaps 100 talents. It was proposed to distribute this among the citizens, but Themistocles persuaded the assembly to apply it to the purpose of building new ships. Special contributions for the same object must have been made soon afterwards. More ships were built, and 2 years later we find Athens with nearly 200 triremes at her command, a navy which could be compared with those of Syracuse and Corcyra. The completion of the Piraeus wall was not attempted at this period, but was accomplished, as we shall see, after the final repulse of the Persians from the shores of Greece. End of Chapter 6, Part 10. Recording by Graham Redman. Invaders. This appeal of Athens to Sparta to interfere and exercise coercion in the common interests of Hellas, and the implied recognition of Sparta as the leading power, has been supposed to mark a climax in that feeling of deference towards her which had been growing up both within and without Greece. The episode has been described as the first direct and positive historical manifestation of Hellas as an aggregate body with Spartan active help. Accordingly, the Athenians sought the intervention of Sparta, complaining that Aegina was Medizing and betraying Greece out of enmity to Athens. The complaint was listened to at Sparta, and King Cleomenes, proceeding to Aegina, seized 10 hostages and deposited them with the Athenians. By this means the hands of Aegina were tied. She was hindered from lending help to the Persians or hampering the men of Athens in their preparations to meet the Bagnell Bury. Chapter 6, Part 8. Struggle of Athens and Aegina. At this time Aegina was the strongest naval power in the Aegean. Hostile feeling had long been the rule between her and Athens, and soon after the fall of the Pisistratids the island had been involved in the quarrel between Athens and Thebes. Legend said that the nymphs Aegina and Thebe were sisters, but it was more. Chapter 6, Parts 8, 9, and 10 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John. More than sisterly sympathy which drove Aegina to declare a state of standing war, a war without herald, as the Greeks called it, against her continental neighbour. Her ships ravaged Phaleron and the Attic coast. It was to be expected that Aegina would side with the Persian when he sailed against her foe, and would cordially desire the humiliation of Athens. The Athenians had some reason to fear that she would give the invader not only her goodwill, but her